This week's lesson is on the big C word of history. That's right, communism. Now, when you think of communism, you might think of Russia, or this hammer and sickle symbol that you've seen before, or Bernie Sanders, the Democratic nominee, although he's not actually a communist. Or you may know something about the Cold War, this time period of conflict between the United States, which is capitalist, and the Soviet Union, which is communist, that enveloped a lot of the world in 45 years of tense conflict. Now, we're not going to really be able to understand communism unless we can also understand its counterpart and the reason that it came about in the first place, capitalism. Both communism and capitalism are ideas and systems that determine how resources are best distributed. Now remember, systems are like rules of the games, the laws and institutions and ways of behaving that control the way that we act and the choices that we make. And this might seem sort of boring, but remember, this is how people determines whether people are rich or if they're poor, where you work, where you live, whether you get health care, and ultimately whether you live or die, which is why there are so many people in history who are willing to die for these ideas. Both communism and capitalism attempt to answer two different questions in different ways. The first one is who gets resources? Resources would be like money, land, and the ability to invest your money and make more money, which is called capital. And this is primarily an economic question. And the second question is who decides who gets what? Which is really a political question because it's a question about who has the power to decide. So let's answer that second question for capitalism. Who decides who gets what? In capitalism, it's the market. Now you might think of like a supermarket or a farmer's market, but the market in capitalism is a little different and a little more theoretical. I'll explain. The market in capitalism is made up of sellers and buyers. Let's make the seller a farmer. And he is selling some carrots, which the buyer is going to buy for some money. You're like, of course, you spend money to buy stuff. This is how my life works. I understand this. But let's think for a second on who decides how much those carrots are worth. It's not really one person who decides. It's something that's determined by this exchange, which is affected by a lot of different factors, including how many other sellers are there, what's the quality of the carrots, how hard are the carrots to grow, and also how many other buyers are there, and how much do the buyers value the carrots, how much are they willing to spend on them. This is all governed by something called self-interest, which is the idea that doing what's best for you makes things better for everybody. The buyer is doing what's best for him, buying some carrots for his dinner. But this also benefits the seller. The seller, on the other hand, is thinking just about himself and doing what's best for him. He's trying to sell some carrots and make some money. But this also benefits the buyers. So the idea is if you do what's best for you, other people will find a way to benefit from that. Let's take a look at how that affects the labor market. So imagine you're the person on the left. You are a worker. You're trying to get a job in a fast food restaurant from this owner. The owner is going to give you some money in the form of a paycheck. We're familiar with this. So what is the worker selling? The worker is selling their labor power in exchange for money. Labor power is like how many hamburgers can you make in an hour? That is labor. You are creating value with the work that you put in. Now, the price of your labor power, the wage that you get, is similarly determined by a lot of other factors. How much skill does it take to make those burgers? And how many other people are there out there like you who are trying to get that same job? I want to emphasize that in capitalism, no one person decides the price of goods or labor on the free market. That's what makes it free. Adam Smith, a Scottish economist in the mid-1700s, who was an early capitalist theorist, called this the I call this the invisible hand of the market. It's an efficient way to distribute resources based on self-interest. And the hand is invisible because you don't know who's actually doing the deciding. Exchanges on the free market were the basis of trade for centuries, right? People carrying goods with horses and camels and ships through the ocean routes and the overland routes of the Silk Roads are one example. People have been exchanging goods for money for hundreds and hundreds of years. But capitalism really levels up in the 1800s in the Industrial Revolution. This was a big change. Let's take a look at this definition of industrial capitalism by historian of capitalism Joyce Appleby. She says that industrial capitalism is an economic system that relies on investment in machines and technology that are used to increase production of marketable goods. Let's break that down a little bit. So machines and technology are making work faster. You can produce more quickly. Increased production is making more stuff. And if you're making more stuff, it's not going to be worth anything unless you can sell it and there's someone to buy it. So there needs two kinds of people who are often actually the same person. You need workers And you need consumers. And industrial capitalism ushered in this consumerist society where suddenly you have all these different options for burgers and handbags and phones and technologies and a million different brands. We're so used to seeing so many different brands and so many different options. It's important to keep in mind that in the course of world history, this is actually pretty rare. So like we said, the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s totally changed the economy. People went from mostly being farmers to mostly working in factories. You can see that urbanization, that means people moving to cities, over the past 500 years, from 1500 to 2016, has changed a lot. And especially you can look over here in the mid-1800s to 1900s when more and more people started moving to cities. Let's take a look at the entire world. Actually, this looks like over 50% of the world right now lives in cities, where it was much more unusual to live in a city much earlier on. Work in factories during the Industrial Revolution was terrible. There was a lot of child labor and unsafe working conditions. There was no safety equipment, no protections, and no compensation if you got injured, like getting your arm chopped off by a dangerous machine or inhaling toxic black smoke by working in the coal mines. Factories were dirty, crowded, noisy, and hot, sometimes upwards of 110 degrees in the summer, and you couldn't take any breaks. You had to keep working quickly. There were no laws about how long you could work. People worked for 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they didn't make enough money to live anywhere better than these crowded and dirty tenement housing. This is a typical family in a tenement house that was taken as part of a campaign to spread awareness about public health in these places. Tenement houses would often have 7, 8, or 9 people crammed into one bedroom, stove on one side, one bed on the other side, and sharing a bathroom down the hall with 4 or 5 other families. These conditions could be even more deadly. One of the deadliest instances of factory conditions was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 in New York City. In this factory, which made shirts and other textiles, the doors were locked to keep workers from sneaking out. So there were no exits once the fire started. Workers, mostly immigrant women, jumped from the windows to avoid the fire. 146 people died. So seeing these miserable conditions of factory work inspired a lot of criticisms of capitalism. And one of these critics was this German sociologist, Karl Marx, perhaps one of the more influential thinkers of human history. And Karl Marx wondered, how could this economic system of capitalism, which is based on, quote, freedom of the market, be forcing most people into wage slavery with so few options to succeed? That doesn't really seem like freedom. This is part 2, by the way. So Marx wrote a bunch about this. He published the Communist Manifesto with his friend Friedrich Engels in 1848, and then went on to publish 3 volumes of Das Kapital, a critical analysis of how capitalism works. Let's see if we can get into it. So Marx's view of capitalism is this. In all of human history, there has been a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. Capitalism has continued this struggle between economic classes of society. The owners were the capitalists, perhaps the factory or railway owners, and the workers, who we called the proletariat. This was class conflict. Now for Marx, inequality isn't a side effect of capitalism. In his analysis, inequality is exactly what makes the system function. Another way of putting that is, there would be no rich people if there were not poor people. Let's take a look at inequality under capitalism. This is a graph of inequality in the United States of wealth. 3 men own as much as the bottom half of Americans. We see on the right, Jeff Bezos, who's the owner of Amazon, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett own more than the bottom 50% of all Americans. And this goes worldwide as well. Worldwide, the richest 1% of the world own 44% of the world's wealth. Almost half of the value in money, in capital, in land is owned by just 1 out of every 100 people in the world. In 2018, the average CEO made $14.5 million a year. The average worker made $39,888 a year. That means that CEOs earned on average 287 times more than the average worker. Not double, not triple, 287 times more. Now, does that mean that CEOs work 287 times harder or 287 times more hours than the average worker? Probably not. So where did all that money come from? Marx has an answer for this. Where does CEO's money come from? Something called surplus value, and I'll try to use an example to explain it. So let's say you're a worker in a coffee shop, the famous coffee shop, Barstuck's, and Barstuck's pays you $9 an hour to churn out some lattes for its esteemed customers, right? You get $9 an hour, that's your wage. And for $9 an hour, you can make 15 lattes in an hour. Each latte costs $5 for a customer to buy, which you sell for a total of $75, which is $75 going back into the pocket of Barstuck's. Now, Barstuck's also pays some extra costs in addition to your labor. They pay for the coffee and the machines that it takes to grind it and the dishwashing equipment and all that stuff, and that costs them about $40 an hour. So in total, with the combination of those other costs plus your wage, Barstuck's is spending $49 an hour in its business. But they're making a revenue of $75 an hour from all of those lattes that they sell. So let's do a little math. 75 minus 49 equals a profit of $26 an hour for Barstuck's. Where did this money come from? They didn't just pull this $26 out of thin air. Marx would say this money came from you, that actually Barstuck's should be paying you more money because you are making them more value, and that actually they're taking away that wage from you is them taking away your rightfully owned money. This is called surplus value, the money that you make for the company, but that you are not getting back in your wages. Basically, the Barstuck's is paying this worker the equivalent of 2 lattes, but she makes 15 lattes. So that means she's making 13 lattes for free. And it seems like you shouldn't be doing work for free. This is Marx's theory of surplus value, that the worker is getting money taken away from them, that the worker is creating more value than they are receiving in wages. And Marx has a term for this. It's called exploitation. Here's a summary. All workers create more value at work than they receive in wages. This is not just some people who make extra low wages or some people who are especially oppressed. He says all workers do this. This is the reason why CEOs make so much more money. The extra surplus value, it says at the bottom, goes into the boss's pocket as profit. Now, people who support capitalism would say, well, those bosses take that money, they invest it in more factories, which give more people more jobs, which is good for everybody. But from a Marxist perspective, this is value that you are creating that your boss is stealing from you. Marx's solution to capitalist exploitation, wait for it, communism. Also socialism. We're going to talk about them as kind of the same thing, but there are some key differences. The ethos of communism, according to Marx, is this, that people should work each according to their ability and get according to their needs. If a communist were to answer this question of who gets resources, the answer would be very simple. Their answer would be everyone. Communists overall value equality, and you can see that in this Soviet propaganda poster from the Soviet Union. All right, so who decides who gets what? Who's responsible for ensuring equality, especially if the free market's not doing a very good job? The communist answer? The government. A government controlled by the workers. In the system, the workers, through the government, own everything. There's no private property. What does that look like? Let's say you wanted to buy a farm to work on or buy a house. That you can't. That farm is owned by the government. That house, also owned by the government. You can't own your own stuff and make your own money off of it. Let's say you wanted to go to the store and get a loaf of bread that you didn't make at home or some new shoes. That bread, you're going to buy it from the government. Those shoes, also from the government. No more Nike, no Adidas, no private companies, just government shoes. Let's say you want to go get a job in a factory. You're not going to be working for Amazon or Google. You're going to be working for, the government. The government controls all the factories, all the industries. And the government will give you a wage for your work. And you'll give your wage right back to the government in a lot of ways in the form of taxes. Not all of it, but most of it. And then the government will take that tax money and redistribute it to all these other people who might be working in other jobs or not, each according to their ability, and also give some back to you. This is a way that the government takes all the resources so that no one person can profit off of the land or off of a job or off of being the owner of a factory. Instead, the government takes the value that everybody makes, gives it right back to everybody else, and that is equal. Now you might be asking yourself, sounds cool. How does that work in practice? That's next week's lesson. According to Marx, as long as owners hold the means of production, those are the factories, the mines, the land, and anything else that produces values, workers will be exploited. They'll have that surplus value taken from them. Workers must seize or take control of the means of production and take collective ownership of factories, mines, companies, and land. Only then will worker control equal no exploitation. Marx's writings inspired communist movements around the world right away. In 1848, the year Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, revolutions in France, Spain, Germany, and Italian states, and over 40 other countries challenged the power of kings. European workers demanded an end to industrial capitalism in these revolutions of 1848. They mostly didn't get what they wanted. Marx's writings inspired communists in America as well as socialists. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the labor movement grew in Europe and the USA as workers joined unions to collectively bargain with their bosses. Many workers went on strike to get their demands met. Labor unions' actions forced governments to pass laws protecting workers. That's why we have the 8-hour workday, a full weekend, safety protections, and child labor laws today. On the left is one of the events of the early labor movement that most galvanized people. In 1886, a bomb went off in Haymarket Square in Chicago at a rally of workers who were fighting for an 8-hour workday. And even though they didn't do it, 8 anarchists were wrongly convicted and sentenced to death, which caused outrage among leftist movements around the world. And this continued into today. After the Chicago Haymarket riot, the Second International, an organization of socialist and labor parties in various countries formed in Paris in 1889, called for a worldwide day of action. In 1904, the Second International made May 1st International Workers' Day, an occasion to march in the street for an 8-hour workday, working class rights, and universal peace, something that's still celebrated by people around the world today. Marx's writings inspired other activists, too, that weren't even quite communists, such as anarchists. Anarchism demanded that workers seize power, like communism, but they didn't want the government part. Instead of large nations, they thought people should collectively organize into small collectives that meet everyone's needs. Like communists, anarchists formed parties and led demonstrations and demanded workers' rights in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Here's Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian revolutionary and founder of collective anarchism, who was a contemporary of Marx. And here is an awesome activist of world history, Russian Jewish immigrant, anarchist, and feminist activist Emma Goldman. This is her mugshot from being arrested. She was arrested in the USA many times for things like distributing birth control, which was then illegal, and speaking out against the World War I draft. Communist movements gathered steam around the world. In 1917, a communist revolution in Russia overthrew Tsar Nicholas II and created the world's first communist state. This is Vladimir Lenin, the leader of Russia's Communist Party, which was called the Bolsheviks, speaking to a crowd in Red Square in 1919. Now, Marx believed that this challenge to owner power would not happen except for a violent revolution. And it seemed like Russia was really fulfilling the dreams of Marx in this way, at least in the beginning. The Russian Revolution inspired other communist revolutions around the world. In China in 1949, led by Mao Zedong. In Cuba in 1959, led by Fidel Castro and others. And in various African nations in the 1970s, including Mozambique, the Congo, Angola, Ethiopia, and Benin. And China and Cuba are still communist to some extent today. Communist movements around the world challenged the balance of power between different nations. For example, communists in Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, that's not him above, that's just a Vietnamese fighter, fought against French colonial control and later against the USA in the 1960s in what was called the Vietnam War in the United States. And this challenge in the balance of power was not always good. Pol Pot, who was the leader of the communist Khmer Rouge in the 1970s and 1980s in Cambodia, was xenophobic and repressive, causing widespread starvation of his people through agricultural restructuring, that means like giving away the land in different ways, and execution of thousands of political opponents. And he was in good company of other major communist leaders who also caused massive starvation and executed thousands of political opponents, including Mao Zedong of China and Stalin, Joseph Stalin of Russia. So let's do a little comparison of capitalism and communism, a review now that we've learned about both. Let's compare two elements, freedom and equality. Capitalism puts a high value on freedom, being able to choose where you live, what you buy, what products you have, what you do if you want to start a business, where if you want to move, so on. But I'm going to put a little question mark by freedom, because is it really freedom when so many people can't afford health care or have to work 16 hours a day in 2 different jobs just to be able to afford their apartment and send their kids to school? This doesn't really seem like freedom when there's such high inequality. And certainly equality is not one of the values of capitalism. Capitalism is based on the idea that some people are going to win and some people are going to lose. Even in the most hopeful views of capitalism, that the losers are still a little bit better off than they otherwise would have been. So let's look at communism. Communism really does value equality. The idea is that everybody should be the same and that everybody should get the basic human rights of housing, of food, and of what they deserve. However, I'll also put a question mark on that. In communist systems that are really authoritarian, where the government is in control, a lot of times there's a lot of corruption, and that equality doesn't end up happening. People who have more power in the government end up getting more than others. And in communism, there's definitely not as much freedom. When the government controls everything, people don't have as much choice to start a business, to buy land, to move where they want to move. We also ask this question, who determines who gets what? In capitalism, that exchange is based on the free market, guided by people's decisions and what their self-interests are, and that determines who gets what. In communism, it's the government, run by the workers, that controls the means of production and distributes resources. Another way to look at this is to ask, what's the role of the government? In capitalism, there's limited government. The idea is that the government should stay out of the economy and just let the free market function. In communism, there's a lot of government. The government, which is owned by the workers, owns all property and controls all economic activity to ensure equality. And now, even though we don't have a strong communist party in the United States today, this economic battle over what should the role of the government be in the economy is one of the biggest battles in our political system, between people who believe there should be a limited government, tend to be more right-wing or Republican, and people who want to see more government, Democrats. Now, these Democrats are still capitalists, but that view of what's the role of the government in the economy is something that has driven political conflict for hundreds of years.